Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to Roots Refuge Farm. My name is Jess. If you're new here, I'm glad you're here. And if you're not new here, I'm glad you're back. Today, I'm going to give you guys a tour of everything that is currently growing in my high tunnel. We have two different high tunnels. This one is fully planted for the overwinter season and into the spring. The other one's still kind of in transition. And while we'll grow a lot of food in that one, and we can take a look at that one another time, today I really want to fully focus right here because that's looking pretty cool in here. All right, so I'm gonna pop in the door, take a look around. The stuff that's in here has grown really quickly, which is really cool to see. And we're already harvesting food out of here. So I garden in the Midlands of South Carolina. We are zone 8, and that means we do have hard freezes here. However, our average low temperatures range between 10 and 15 Fahrenheit, like -9, -12 Celsius. It can get colder than that, though it would be very unusual. With that being the case, we can actually grow cold hardy varieties all year. And in fact, where I live and in this general vicinity, it's very common in the middle of the winter to drive past a large agricultural field of kale or cabbages or collards, because a lot of the country's food is grown in this region thanks to the balmy weather. So everything, for the most part, there's a couple volunteers popping up. Everything in the high tunnel right now is frost hardy, meaning that it can freeze, but being in the high tunnel, it has a measure of protection that if the freeze were to get really hard, it's going to protect these things from being damaged. Now, if we had like a really freak, like sub-zero temperature freeze, there's a good chance that some of this stuff would still be damaged, but if it were allowed to acclimate, a lot of it would probably live with the cover of the high tunnel. It's a little windy outside right now, and you guys are going to hear that. To tell you a little bit about the tunnel, this is a 26 by 60 high sidewall high tunnel from Grower Solution. We've had it here for about 2 years. We put it up about 2 years ago. It currently actually still has shade cloth over the top of it, which is kind of the weird circumstances of growing here in South Carolina. It's so sunny and warmish here, even in the middle of the winter, that I have not yet felt confident in pulling the shade cloth off. Even though we've had multiple freezing nights, we still have some days that are getting warm enough that if I were to take the shade cloth off while the high tunnel is fully enclosed, it would exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 Celsius in here, which would send all of these brassicas straight to seed. At first I kind of worried about the decision to leave the shade cloth on because I didn't want to stunt anything, but with how fast everything in here has been growing, I don't really feel the need to mess with it yet. So we have the high sidewall version of the high tunnel because we also use this in the summers, and the high sidewalls make that possible. So we're able to open this up. It stays completely up during the warm part of the year. We never lower the walls down. And the shade cloth actually allows this structure to be a refuge from the sun when it's really hot. So this is a year-round structure. Of course, in the summer, we're not growing the cold hardy things. We're growing like tomatoes and peppers and different things like that. Right here in the door, you can see all of these plants. These are actually nasturtiums. These are very frost tender. However, they're volunteers, and it has yet to really freeze in the tunnel at all, obviously, or else those would be really damaged. And then right inside here, I've got a lettuce and a bok choy. There are a couple things here that are just filling in. And then I've got a lot of kale right here in different varieties. This is just your typical blue scotch curled kale. You'll notice this is not pest damage on these kales. This is my 18-year-old son grabbing leaves for his bearded dragon, so that's why they look like that. I always tell him to harvest the outside leaves, so you'll notice that that's which ones they are. Why he doesn't pull the whole thing off, I'm not sure, but it's fine. It doesn't hurt anything. It's just funny looking. This variety here is called Red Russian. You can see that it has these really lovely purple ribs. It comes in very purple, and then as the green parts grow, you can really see that the ribs are the main part of the purple color. Flavor-wise, I would say like the Red Russian and the the blue scotch are very similar. This is your traditional kale that you'll more commonly see in stores. Here, this is a variety called Ragged Jack. This kale I have found to be probably the most hardy out of all of them. In here, it doesn't matter at all because they're all being kept warm, but kale can exist in pretty cold temperatures, especially if it's acclimated. I had one winter in Arkansas where I had lots of different kales when we got down to like -12 or something like that. It was really cold, -22 Celsius, and the Ragged Jack was actually the one that fared best in that. Here we have Dino Kale. This is also one of my favorites. I just think it's really cool looking. They're kind of sporadically placed here. And here I've got a few, they're called peacock kales, and they're very similar to that red Russian. But you can see the ribs aren't quite as purple, and they're coming in with a little bit of purpling in the middle. I actually expected this one to be flashier than it is. It's fine, but I think compared to the red Russian is actually prettier. And this one is one that's like acclaimed for being really flashy. I don't think it is more so than the other. This is my first year to grow the peacock kale. I actually haven't eaten any of it yet, but it's one that Baker Creek recently started to carry, and I have seen it used in landscaping as an ornamental variety, so I thought it would be interesting to try. I haven't really heavily harvested these at all yet. Jackson has obviously harvested for our Beardy, but now that they're kind of starting to get more established, I would feel more comfortable coming out and starting to really harvest them more heavily. All right, beyond that, I've got a few different plants of lettuces here. This is kind of a little more random because some sort of pest got in here when we still had the sidewalls up and ate a lot of these plants down, so we just filled in the spaces. So that's what's up with the lettuces being there. And then down this wall, I've got a snowball cauliflower. We're nowhere near getting anything substantial on these yet. It hasn't started to create a head at all. Kale's one of those things that I always plant too much of because it's pretty versatile. I would say the things that we use it the most for is to just saute it and cook it down and eat it as a side with dinner. I put it in soups, like I make a sausage and potato soup that has a good deal of kale in it. And my kids like kale chips, so we'll take them and then tear them up, put some oil and like salt and pepper or whatever seasonings you want to use, and bake them in the oven until they get crispy. That's probably our biggest applications. And of course the bearded dragon, which she can eat any like leafy green or fruit or whatever. She can eat cut up vegetables, but kale's just happens to be her favorite thing to eat. The thing is that with like cooking any sort of greens, if you're cooking mustard greens or collards or kale greens or anything like that, you can harvest a ton and just pile it up in a pan, and it's going to shrink down so much that I could probably use more kale plants than that. I have a few more growing in other places, so that's not all I have. But if I were just like making salads or eating it raw or throwing a little bit in smoothies, that would be plenty. So it's kind of one of those plants that I don't mind ending up with extra. I kind of err on the side of extra because if there is extra, I can always just harvest it and give it to the animals. And it's one of those things that you can just keep picking from. It's going to just keep growing. I just always harvest those outer leaves. Here I did another row of dino kale in the back. I planted that later, obviously it's a lot smaller. And then on this side, there are a couple random things growing, like that little lettuce plant. Here's a little dino kale. Those are seeds that got away from me. But this row right here, these are golden beets. Still rather on the small side. I would say that these will probably be harvestable in another 8 weeks or so. Beyond that, here are a few red cabbage plants, obviously very young. And down here on this end, we've got several. This is the 1 kilo slow bolt Nappa cabbage, and these are quite young. They've got a little bit of pest damage on them. I have not done anything proactively about that yet, simply because it's not terrible. And it started before we had our next round of freezing nights. It's going to freeze pretty good this week, and I think that will probably manage the pest. So when outer leaves on cabbages get some holes in it, I don't worry too much. Now, if the pest pressure is persisting when the heading is starting and I'm starting to get leaves on the head, then I'll come in and like dust some diatomaceous earth or do something with the sake of these little, this is probably little caterpillars of some sort. BT is a good thing to spray on to deal with caterpillars. With BT, you want to make sure that you put it on first thing in the morning. In the winter, it's not as big of a deal. In the summer, you can deal with some burning with your plants. But the thing is, BT works. It's an organic pest control, and it works by breaking down the stomach linings of the caterpillars, of the insects. So they have to actually eat the leaf. They have to actually eat the BT in order for it to kill them. So if you put it on first thing in the morning, that's the time that they're typically going to start eating. So if you do it in the evening, like, it might not be as effective. The truth is, I'll sometimes go an entire season and not spray anything like that on my plants. I prefer to do nothing. I prefer to like balance the ecosystem and kind of let things go on their own. But in the case of something like this, if I were to have a really persistent population of caterpillars that was going to keep me from getting a harvest at all, I may come in and spray something like BT or sprinkle something like diatomaceous earth once or twice to knock that population back, and that's usually all it takes. Typically the freeze will do it, and that's enough. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on these. I've got some more pest pressure up in the front that we'll see, but I feel like it's so mild and that we're getting back into the cold that it's probably going to be a non-issue. All right, down here on this whole end, these are all ranunculus. I planted these corms several weeks ago. They're all spread out in here, equally spaced. These are actually flowers that will not bloom until spring. So this whole space back here, I've just got it mulched. They'll probably get hit with a cup with worm compost tea a time or two. This whole tunnel will. Whereas we will be harvesting this food over the winter and then into the spring. These will not actually be harvestable flowers until spring. My plan for this tunnel next year, in the spring, the next growing season, is for this whole tunnel to be cut flowers, hence the ranunculus. So they have to grow over the winter in order to bloom in spring. Everything else that I put in here in the spring can be planted and bloom the same season. So in these beds, I'm actually planning on doing some dahlia bulbs, which I'll put in as we harvest these like heading things, which is what I've put a lot of up the middle. I'll leave the spaces blank for the most part because we'll be harvesting like December, January, February. So for the most part, if I'm harvesting things out of a bed in February and my last frost is like the very beginning of April, I probably will not have enough time to plant like another wave of cauliflowers. I'll just have to put the spring wave of the brassicas somewhere else. Amend the beds with some compost, keep them mulch, and then whenever it comes time, I'll plant my flowers for the spring. The only exception I could see potentially replanting some of these spaces is if I take some of these brassicas out and put something like radishes or something that's like a very quickly maturing root vegetable. But anything that's going to take like months, I'm not going to put it in. My plan as far as the cut flowers goes is I want to do a couple of these middle beds with dahlias. I do want to do some cosmos. I want to do cutting sunflowers. I'd like to do a good deal of zinnias out here. And my hope is next year we're actually going to be working on a farmer's market in town, and I want to be able to sell just some small bouquets of cut flowers. I'm not really trying to become like a big scale cut flower farmer by any means. But I just think it would be something incredibly joyful. I think it would be beautiful. And we do have so much space that I can spare some food space just to grow something lovely. Here in this bed, these are actually Romanesco cauliflowers, which are the really cool, spirally looking cauliflowers. I'm so excited about this. I think I've successfully grown like one or two of those in my whole gardening career, but I've bought them at the farmer's market multiple times. So I'm very pumped to have these. I'm just cheering them on every time I come back here. Again, more ranunculus that goes all the way down to the end. This section here is planted with rutabagas, a variety called Laurentian, which is like a purple, dark purple shouldered rutabaga. I really like rutabagas. I never discovered my love for them until I started growing them myself. They weren't very popular to eat like in where I grew up, I was never once in my life served a rutabaga. The only exposure I'd ever even had to the idea of rutabagas was Winnie the Pooh. Whenever Rabbit, oh, there's a buggy on the camera screen. Whenever the Rabbit is his name, he had his garden, and he always talked about growing rutabagas. When I started gardening and I would look through the seed catalogs, I first discovered that I liked radishes. Previously, I had not known that radishes were very good. My only experience of them was having like small slivers on tacos, but I learned to roast radishes and I learned that I really liked them. And so I decided to just explore all manner of root vegetables and what I could do with them. Now, roasted rutabagas are really good. A lot of times I'll spatchcock a chicken, and then in the pan with the chicken, I'll just dice up rutabagas and fill them all up in the pan so they actually roast down in the juices and the fat from the chicken. And that's really tasty. But my favorite way to eat rutabagas is to peel them and cut them up like you would potatoes, boil them, and then mash them. Oh, I've got water drops falling on me. And then mash them up with some sour cream and chives, a little butter in there. I've heard it's also good if you mash boiled carrots, and I've never done that before. But my goodness, mashed rutabagas with sour cream and chives are so lovely. Definitely a little different than eating potatoes. They're not quite as starchy. They definitely have a little bit of a sharper flavor and a more unique flavor. My tunnel's raining on me. But they're very delicious. So I'm looking forward to those rutabagas becoming harvestable for that reason. Here I've got one row of red acre cabbage and another row of other cabbage. This is actually two different varieties. This is called Flat Dutch, and it's a flat-leafed cabbage. This is called Savoy, and it is like a curly leaf cabbage. Cabbages, all three of these. I'm going to use them all about the same. Why do I have all of these varieties? Because it's who I am. I just like to grow beautiful things. I like to grow variety. We'll see which one does better. It's interesting to me to look at how, for instance, here we have this whole bed of cabbages. This one actually does have a good deal of pest pressure on it. So does this one. The Flat Dutch and the Savoy, they don't have a single hole on them. So apparently, given the option, these insects chose the red. That'd be something to note. In this instance, it's not severe enough to really feel like I need to pay that much of attention to it. But if I had 6 different cabbage varieties in a space like this, and I noted that one particular variety seemed to draw way more insect pressure than the others, I would either, one, not grow that variety anymore, or I might grow a couple of that variety as a trap crop, allowing the insects to flock to it, so that my other varieties would be left alone. And in this case, it's not severe enough for it to really matter. Here, this row is Lieutenant Broccoli. That's actually a hybrid that I bought, started plants at a local store. I didn't mention, but a lot of these plants are started from seed here in my greenhouse. I would say at least 3/4 of them we started from seed. However, I did pick up some things like these heading broccolis, just because when we started seeds I didn't have any seeds for those convenient, and so I got those at a local nursery. Now this plant over here, I'm pretty sure this is a parsley. This is something that was left after last season. We actually built up these raised beds here, and this would just happen to be here, and we just filled it in around it. I just tasted it. It tastes like parsley to me, and I can't really remember. A lot of the things that grew out here last season were volunteers, and so it's healthy, whatever it is. Here I've got a nice little span of space that is currently unplanted. This is going to be another wave of root vegetables, probably more rutabagas, more carrots. Here I've got a bed of snow crown cauliflower. Very young, not a lot to see yet. Now this bed is kind of interesting. Little hodgepodge going on. This is a red cabbage. This is a sprouting broccoli. Down here, there's another red cabbage. What those plants are, planted off in these corners, is where I was splitting plants that had like 2 in a cell when I was like planting these things. And these just got stuck in here in random places. And you know, I'm harvesting off of them, so it's cool. There's a random lettuce. These are sweet peas. So these are actually cutting flowers. These will not bloom until the spring. And these all volunteered up in the front of the tunnel because I had them growing up there in spring of last year. And when we built these beds up, we moved these back to these spaces and they've taken off. So they don't look like much now, but they'll be really pretty in the spring. And these are actually inoculated mushroom logs. So these two logs are oak logs that have been inoculated with plugs, and I cannot remember the type of mushrooms. I think, I don't want to say it wrong. I don't think that maybe these are the train wreckers. I can't remember. I'm going to ask Will and I'll put it up here on the screen. But he and Benjamin actually did these one day over the summer. They came out here. Will had been, I think he was working on some of these at his house and he brought some stuff out here. They have to be in the shade. And so they're here in this bed and they will fruit probably the beginning of next year or late, you know, like spring of next year into the summer. So that'll be really cool. Let's grow some mushrooms here in this bed with the sweet peas and the random other little orphan plants that were left over whenever I was separating cells. Oh, and the nasturtium that is voluntary here. It's funny how I always end up with favorite little spots in gardens, and this is probably my favorite little random bed. This walkway is full of nasturtium also, you can see it. Just there's little bitty ones here. There's a big one. At some point this winter, it will freeze hard enough outside that it freezes inside the tunnel, and all those nasturtiums will be toast at that point. This is sprouting broccoli, or broccolini, or often called broccoli rabe. I've already harvested a good deal off of this, and it will just continue to grow. They get these little sprouts. When they're small like this, I'll let them get a little bigger than that. Let me find a good one. That's probably a good example. So it gets to be about this point. And I want to harvest them before the little buds start to open. So I just pop these off. I'll do this one like this. Now I'm sure you could do something fun and fancy with these, but especially when something first starts coming in, I typically eat it just how it is. Like these, we've been taking them once I get a good handful. In the meantime, if I need to harvest them because they're starting to open, I put them in a little mason jar with water in the house and stick it in the fridge. They'll stay pretty fresh and crisp like that for at least a handful of days if they're sitting in water. The issue is that they may still continue, the flowers may still continue to open, so you got to keep an eye on them. Once I have a good handful, I'll just drizzle a tiny bit of olive oil on these, some good flaky salt, some pepper, and roast them in a 400-degree oven for about 20 minutes until the edges start to crisp up. They get brown bits. They're really tasty. All of my kids who, if I were to serve them like steamed broccoli, they may balk. All of them will eat broccoli rabe or sprouting broccoli, every single one of them. They actually request it. They really like it because it's delicious. I actually wish I had planted one more bed of these plants, simply because whenever you are cooking for a big family, you know, sometimes these things are coming in and if I'm picking like 8 or 9 of these at a time, that's really not enough for a side dish for my family. But if I had 2 beds, I would be able to harvest a more substantial amount at once. That's okay. Next year I will plant more. Here's another bed of the red acre cabbage. You can see that these are larger than the others that I pointed out. So anytime I'm planting anything like cabbage, I want to succession sow those, even if it's only by a couple of weeks, so that I'm not ending up with 48 cabbages at the same time. So with the broccoli rabe or the sprouting broccoli, you kind of have a really short window when you can harvest that. I like to wait until it looks like the buds are getting kind of close to open, because I know that it's really not going to get any bigger than that. I want to harvest it when it's as big as possible so I get as much food as I can from what I planted. With cabbages, you know, they'll start heading up and you'll have a head that is maybe only like this big. You could harvest it at that point. You can let it grow and it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now there's a point where cabbages get really big and they start to get mushy on the inside. So you cannot just leave them indefinitely. What I like to do is whenever I've got, let's say I've got what, 12 in this bed right now? Yeah, 12 in this bed. I've got another bed with quite a few that are about the same size. And then I have a whole bunch of like the Nappa cabbages and stuff like that. Usually when they start getting big enough to constitute a side dish for dinner for my family, I'll go ahead and cut one off and I'll fry it or something like that. Or then, you know, maybe a few days later, they're a little bit bigger, I'll cut another one and I'll make slaw with something for dinner. And then we'll slowly use them as they get bigger and bigger. And then when they get to the point that they're like really a solid size and they haven't been sitting here too long, that's when I'll harvest like 6 at a time and make a lot of sauerkraut. And if I succession sow, and I've got these 12 and then I've got 12 down there that will be starting to get harvestable a few weeks after these, I can for the most part extend the period of time that I can just come out and harvest dinner. For me, I love growing my food year round in whatever capacity. I love the high tunnel because it offers that option, because my favorite thing in gardening is to be able to just walk outside and harvest my food. I love having it go from garden to plate on the same day. That's like the optimum of gardening. Now, if you're trying to grow most of your family's food, that's not even really how you do it, maybe even half the time. Like a lot of the stuff that you're gonna eat throughout the year only grows during a certain window. Tomatoes, for instance, you know, we've got like a 3-4 month window that we're really heavily harvesting tomatoes. And during that time, we're putting up sauce and sauces and diced tomatoes. And then throughout the year, we're eating them out of the jar. But I love the window that we get to eat them out of the garden. With cabbages, you know, a sauerkraut, fermenting things and then putting them in the fridge, because they'll last in the fridge for a long time fermented. I mean, then it's not fresh cabbage, it's sauerkraut. Like, and sauerkraut is great. I love sauerkraut, but it's not the same as fresh cabbage. It's not the same as slaw. It's not the same as fried cabbage. And so I want both. I want to have both. I want some for now and some for later. But if I can extend the window that I'm getting it for now, I'd like to do that. And that's why you see multiple different stages of cabbages here in this high tunnel. This bed is all Brussels sprouts, 2 different varieties. I've got a green variety and a purple variety. These were purchased as started plants. I have some over in the other tunnel that were started from seed, and they're starting to get little Brussels sprouts. These have not really started to develop anything yet. Oh, well, maybe that's not true. Look, there's the tiniest little Brussels sprouts starting in the armpit of these plants. This is the purple one. Brussels sprouts, very similarly to cabbage. I'll start harvesting them when the sprouts are a little on the smaller side, and when I do that, I may just take 2 stalks of them to make one meal and get all of the smaller sprouts off of them. And then as they continue to grow, I'll just harvest them as they're getting bigger and bigger. Really, any brassicas homemade, they have a different texture than store-bought. Like store-bought cabbage can be kind of rubbery, whereas whenever you eat it straight out of the garden, it's gonna have like a crisper texture. I feel like it has more flavor whenever it's homegrown. But I don't notice it nearly as much. The difference isn't as marked with cabbage as with Brussels sprouts. The texture of homegrown Brussels sprouts is very different than store-bought. Even if you've bought them on the stalk at the store, I feel like homegrown, if you can harvest them that day and eat them that day, they have this light texture that I've never experienced anywhere else other than eating Brussels sprouts straight out of my garden. I like a lot of Brussels sprouts, but homegrown ones, oh man, they're so good. I've been watching the ones in the other tunnel like a hawk, waiting for them to get ready because we're all really excited to have our first homegrown Brussels sprouts of the year. Sprouts take a long time, so like I likely won't be harvesting anything off of these until like late winter. Now over here, I've got really some really nice Nappa cabbages. This is where I was saying there is some damage on the outer leaves, but they're starting to head and they look mostly pretty good. I feel pretty good about them. I don't think they're quite ready to begin harvesting yet, but I was just noticing that these down on the end, yeah, they don't have a lot of firmness in the head yet, but probably in 2 weeks or so, I'll be able to make dinner out of these. And then right here, I've got a little row of some carrots. Up here in this front bed, these are little violas, like Johnny Jump Ups. A couple of volunteer zinnias here that made it through that cold snap. I guess it just didn't make it all the way in here. Those would be dead. And here I have a few purple bok choys. Now this is interesting. I've actually never successfully grown purple bok choys because in my experience these have been massive pest traps. And so I actually put these up here in the front expecting them fully to be like a trap cop, expecting them to pull all the pests. Now, they do have some holes in them, but this one is actually starting to fill out enough that I think I might actually end up getting to eat that. I don't know that I've ever harvested any that was edible, because they're usually so pest riddled by the time we get to them being harvestable. So I'm excited about that. That is the entirety of the tunnel, everything that's growing out here. With winter crops, you know, you're not waiting on fruit, because everything we grow in the winter is considered a vegetable. And of course, in the gardening world, but the botanical world, I guess you should say, vegetable doesn't mean anything. You know, in the culinary world, we call a vegetable, we know what we're saying when we're saying we're eating a vegetable. But in the botanical world, you know, a kale, for instance, is a leaf. A carrot is a root. A celery is a stem. A broccoli is a flower head. And so they're just different parts of a plant, which of course a fruit is like the seed-bearing structure of a plant. So we eat the tomatoes and the peppers. We eat lots of fruits during the summer garden, but in the winter garden it's pretty much all vegetables. We're just eating the plants. Now, none of these plants currently right now have any seeds on them, because these are all young juvenile plants, which that's when the roots and the leaves and the stems are the most tender. So with vegetables, we typically eat them when they're young. Now, if they get to the point of seeding, the plant itself is really not that good to eat anymore. So it's an interesting thing, because all of these plants, we could pick them when they're this tall and eat them. You know, with these kales, when they're barely up at the ground, I mean, you could eat kale microgreens and they'd be really tasty. So what's beautiful about a winter garden like this is that we've begun a little bit of harvesting out here. You know, we've begun harvesting a little bit of kale, and we'll begin harvesting young heads of cabbage, and we've begun harvesting the early sprouts of the sprouting broccoli. Now, as the winter goes on, as long as we're able to protect everything from extreme temperatures, we'll get to harvest more and more as roots develop. And of course, you can harvest your roots when they're really small, or you can let them get larger. It's just a matter of preference or a matter of need. If I want to make dinner out of my garden, I may pull a young cabbage head, even though if I left it 2 or 3 more weeks, it would be 3 times the size and give me more food later. It's just the decision, do I want food now or do I want food later? And I really want food all winter, which is why we have all of this food growing in the high tunnel. And though I know for a lot of you who watch like daily vlogs and stuff, you know when I planted these things, you've seen me reference them or maybe even talk about them, but I thought it would really be fun for us to do some tours through the tunnels over the winter, so you can kind of see that season and what it looks like. It's very different than the summer season. It's gloriously hands-off, you know, once it's in and mulched, other than watering it, and then the occasional douse of worm compost tea. I don't really have to do much, and yeah, I get to just come get food. And I'm glad to share the process with you guys. Thank you for hanging out with me today and all the days you do. I bless you. Until next time.